Service Center, the Salvation Army of Pickens County. We serve the entire county from this location. I'm here today representing our area commander, Andy and Amy Kelly. They are the area commanders out of Greenville, and they have leadership and direction over Greenville, Pickens, and Oconee County. So if you see the area command reference in anything, that's kind of how that works. And we serve Pickens County, and the donations and support provided through Pickens County stays in this facility and helps our neighbors here right in Pickens County. The goal of today, what we're doing today, is part of what the Salvation Army wanted to do is properly assess the needs of for us is to complete a mission planning study. That's the terminology we use. And it's an assessment, and the assessment is conducted by an outside consultant. Our advisory council interviewed a number of consulting firms, and we picked the Bridge Consulting Group out of the Atlanta, Georgia area to serve in that capacity. They were hired to conduct this assessment on our behalf, and Paul Kernow is going to present his report after completing that mission planning study. That's what this meeting is. I'm a member in the crowd just like you. He's going to go over the results of that study. Depending on those results, we will use this assessment to pull together teams made up of community members to develop a strategic plan to properly address those needs. That would move on, if necessary, to a feasibility study. Is it financially capable? Are we financially capable as a county to do whatever comes out of this report? And the last and not least, the fourth piece of those four stages would be the capital campaign and beginning to raise the funds necessary to operate. Now, those steps are very, very intentional, based on years of experience of the Salvation Army, and they're for our protection as members of the community. Without those steps, there can be problems in operations, and there can be problems in the sustainability of what we try to do. My commitment as the director here is in service to the people of Pickens County. And as we get these results, I'm going to cheerlead and push, but I can't do it alone. I can share that with you. We do this as a community together. So I'm going to quit talking and let Paul have the floor now. Paul has years of experience in the consulting group. He's got experience with the Salvation Army. He and his team, some of you have already met, and I've been very, very impressed with the skill set is one thing, but to have the insight to the reality of the need and the reality of the people, we're still serving people, to have that sensitivity and that compassion is a real asset. Paul, personally, I really appreciate his heart and his spirit. So with no further ado, this is Paul, and he'll lead us from here.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. You're welcome.
And thank you for taking time to come out this morning for this presentation time. I'm going to explain a little bit of how we did this study to you, but let me assure you from the beginning, if you have a copy in your hands, I'm not going to go page by page. We would be here until dinner time, and I don't know if Jim could order in dinner for everybody. We're going to do this in an hour if we can, but really the main thing are the points that I'll talk about, and any questions that you have in here, please ask them. I'm a former teacher, so questions really help out in a presentation time, so please don't be shy. As Jim mentioned, the Salvation Army hired us to come in the Bridge. 3 of us came into town, and many of you were involved in the interviews that we did. We interviewed more than 50 people face to face. We then did multiple interviews on the phone for people whose schedule didn't match up for when we were in town. Then we had hundreds of people go online and complete a survey that we had done. So obviously for us, the more data that we have, the stronger the results can be shown as we go through the study. So we then take all of the data that we've done online, all of the interview results that we had, And the three of us, we sit down and write a report. And one of our offices is in Portland, Oregon. One is in South Georgia. One is in North Georgia. So I can't even count up for you the countless times, hours that we were on conference call sharing this report, editing, changing, re-emphasizing, going back, checking our data again to make sure that what we're presenting to you is accurate as much as possible that we can present to you. So out of that comes this report. You should have in front of you the report. There's another section of recommendations. We'll get to that very quickly. There's another section of appendices that give more data that we collected and researched. So let's jump in and see what the surveys and this report tells us. Again, we're looking for discovering the unmet needs or the underserved needs in the community. One of the first things that comes up out of our survey was that the Salvation Army is seen as doing good work in the county, and that we'll talk a little bit more later on, but there's good collaboration that goes on with other agencies and other ministries and churches, and that is appreciated. Jim Abbott and Brenda are in this four-step process that Jim is speaking about. We've had other studies that we've done where we can't say these nice things about the staff, and it becomes a challenge right from the very beginning, as you can well imagine. But here, there's a real sense that Jim and Brenda represent the Army so well, their commitment to the mission of the Salvation Army to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ and to meet human needs in His name without discrimination. They embody that, and they're very passionate about helping people. And for those of you who interact with them regularly, you know that and see that. And the services of the Salvation Army are seen as vital to the community and to the county, and that this collaboration is obvious and appreciated. Now, I would like to say that the collaboration is amongst all agencies and all ministries, but as you know, that's almost impossible to say in any community. However, far more than most studies that we do, we see much more collaboration here and an interest of not so much about, well, this is my ministry or my agency, rather, together, how can we help people who need our help? And that is a wonderful place to be county-wide, not just in one community, but county-wide. Next, the county and the community that works together, this is seen as that. The Salvation Army is seen as an effective partner. And multiple people told us online, in person, and by phone that they saw where the Salvation Army could take a leadership role in certain social service programs and social service ministry programs. And we'll talk more about that as we get through here. I will call out to you every now and then some pages in your study that I'll refer to that will make it easier for you to see and read than perhaps what is up on the screen. One point about Jim and Brenda that I want to make sure you know and you've seen, because if you're in an agency or a ministry yourself, you're probably working the same way. We think they're pretty much at capacity. For two people, they're pretty much at capacity of what they can do. If you're in a ministry or an agency, undoubtedly you aren't overstaffed either. So you understand when you get to a certain capacity. And as we go through the study and talk about potential to grow programs or to launch new programs and services, with that comes the idea there's going to have to be more people involved than Jim and Brenda to make those kinds of things work on a long term. You can look in page 24 in your report, page 24 in the report, and it will be easier for you to see, but let me try to point out here. These are the most
You want to bring his phone, or do you want to take it?
Important undermet or unmet needs in the community.
Put it right here.
And when you look at your chart, you might be able to more readily see them, but the blue is first place, The yellow is second place, the gray is third place, and the one that comes out all the way along, and the total of them, is in the unmet need is homeless families. Yes, sir?
What do you mean by first place, second place, and third place?
So people had the opportunity online or in person to tell us what were the top 3 needs in the community. So whatever they named as 1 became first place here. What was the second greatest unmet or underserved need became second place, and then same thing for third place. So they would name, later in the study there's a list of probably 20 needs that were seen in the community, but these were the ones that were talked about most often and rated as most important. Does that help? More people talked about this as being the top need, as the most unmet need was homeless families. It rated not quite second place, because you see some yellow here, that the more people voted as this as being the second most important, and then the third most important over here, and you can see that mental health was talked about, but was most often mentioned as the third most important need that was underserved in the county.
So this means that the homeless families were most frequently mentioned as
Yes.
unmet need.
Yes,
The bottom is the biggest unmet need.
that's correct. And the way you can see as it coming out here with being the largest, right next to that, of course, we have homeless prevention, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes in our recommendations. But as you look through homeless families, homeless individuals, homeless prevention, these were 3 of the top items that were coming in. Mental health, behavioral health. When we take a look at that, we know that that is so involved in all of these issues, with domestic violence, with youth, with seniors, all of the homeless issues, the behavioral health, the mental health, although not number 1 rated here, we know plays into all of it so much. And while there's good services being provided now, it's still not meeting all of the need. And we'll get into some of that as we go further into the report. Any other questions about this chart as you look at it? We will start to put these into an order. This is what it looks like, unmet or underserved needs in Pickens County. Again, this idea of homelessness, this crisis emergency shelter. As you know, there were people in the last week who were displaced. They were put out of their home for whatever reason, for multiple reasons. Bad decisions they made, other decisions that were made, fire, flooding, whatever it was. There was a reason, and they perhaps ended up sleeping in their car for a night or two. There's an interesting dichotomy in the county about definition of homeless. There's the definition of point in time and what that number represents, and then your school district has another definition. And there's a large number of students who aren't living in their own home and are thus by the school defined as being homeless. They're living with a relative, they're living with a neighbor, they're couch surfing, they're in and out of homes, they're moving all the time. And of course, we can be real here, when that happens, it's situations that sometimes are ripe for abuse. So kids who are in school, trying to learn, trying to go to school and be on top of things, don't have a home. And the home that they're staying in may be an abused situation for them. So it's a terrible thing that goes on, but that's the reality of what's happening. That's not unique to Pickens County by any means, but it is happening here. It is happening here. So let's take a look at these. Again, with the point in time, this is the crisis, the emergency shelter, a place to be able to send a family, a mom with kids, a dad with kids, for an overnight or 2 nights or 3 nights before they're able to transition into one of the other agencies, ministries, church programs. There's a huge gap there. The reality is that's not happening. And the other reality is there's this stopgap measure that you have of putting people in hotels when you can afford it and when the situation is right. And of course, that is not good social services. That's not good ministry work. That's not good agency work. It's great to get them into a place where they can be comfortable for an evening or two, but we also know that there are situations where they can get in where there's drug use, there's trafficking going on. It's just not the best place to be able to transition people into a hotel for any length of time before they're able to transition into a ministry or an agency. The homeless prevention program is talked about on page 40, and this is something that you're all working on to, again, through the collaboration. A lot of it, again, goes back to behavioral and mental health services. A lot of it goes to the agencies that are working with people on a daily basis who need food, who need shelter, who need counseling, who need transportation. All of those things play a part in this, and you've got a good launch of that. You've got that collaboration going on, some partnerships going on to help that. We'll talk more about that when we get to the recommendations. Page 38 talks about the behavioral and mental health and the county agency that you have and the good work that they do. There's no doubt about it. But one of the big issues for all of you, if you're in an agency or a ministry, one of the big issues is transportation. And this is a key unmet need. When we had our chart up here, here it comes up as 5, and yet as we talk to people, over and over, they said, well, we have this service, but people can't get to it. We know of this service being offered over here, but these are the hours, and people can't get there. There's no, I mean, the cat bus just doesn't go everywhere, right? So that's going to be a significant issue for the county, for you to begin to figure out, what do you do about transportation? And we'll talk a little bit about that as we get into the recommendations. Youth and after school. Often when we do studies, this is a huge gap. It's not a huge gap in Pickens County. Between the YMCA, the kinds of things that they're offering after school, the schools offering after school programs, and then the mentoring program that the Y provides, are all seen in very, very positive light and very strong. I think from the Y's perspective, what they would like to have is another 400 or 500 mentors who would want to come along and work with the students. That program, they don't lack for students who would like to have a mentor. But they do lack for people who are volunteering to become a mentor. And many of the people we interviewed already involved in agencies or ministries were a mentor, had been volunteering in that program as well, and could personally talk about the impact it's had on them and on the student that they've been working with. This transportation, again, is just so significant for you. And I know that as people that we talk to, there have been a couple attempts to do something county-wise or in Easley or in a certain area. And until you get that solved, it's going to be a real challenge. You know, your elderly neighbor who needs to go to the doctor to get results on blood work and get prescriptions re-upped, and they have no way to get there. How do you fix that? Well, there are different ways you can do that, but it really does take a whole community, agencies, individuals, and county government to make all of that work. And then the last one was the domestic violence and abuse. And of course, this ties in, again, to the behavioral and mental health, as well as the crisis shelter, the emergency shelter available. That when mom and kids need to get out of a situation, where do they go? Too often they stay because they don't know of services available, or that they could go somewhere and get out of that situation and the abuse continues. You know that. So that's one of the key things that are going to have to be addressed. A couple overviews, overarching things that need to be done before we talk about recommendations. First off, overarching recommendation, the Advisory Council for the Salvation Army here needs to be revitalized. On page 17, you have a list of the members of the council, and Jim and I and our team have been talking about this, and Jim and Brenda, and we really need the council to be between 15 and 18 people. We need to have committees functioning on them, and I'll talk more about that when we get into the recommendations. But it's vitally important for the long-term ability and capacity of the Salvation Army to move forward with, again, expanding current programs or launching new programs, is to have that advisory council that is functioning and has capable, leadership-driven people on it. So that's one of the things you could help us with in suggesting, recommending people to us that should be on that council. The reason it's called the council and not a board is, as Jim mentioned, Greenville is the area command, and there's a Salvation Army Advisory Board there. And this council from Pickens County reports up to that board and interacts with that board and with Major Andy Kelly on a regular basis. So the council really needs to be revitalized and functioning well. As Jim mentioned, in this process, the next step the Salvation Army requires is that from this report and the recommendations, once the council is well and functioning, that you go into a strategic planning process, because the recommendations we're going to give are recommendations. We aren't coming in to say, this is what you must do, this is what you must do. Rather, this is what our study has found, and these are things you consider, so that those people that are on the advisory council, when it's full force, they are going to make the decision about what recommendations do they implement and what does that look like. So the advisory council would be working very closely with Jim and Brenda and Major Kelly to move forward to decide which of these recommendations would you implement and how would that happen and what would it look like. So that's the next step in the process. So the revitalization would go into the strategic visioning process. In that process, if we were the ones to do that process with you, we help you create a value statement, a purpose statement, and a vision statement that then leads to action steps and goals that members of the advisory council take on responsibilities and go out and seek people in the community to help them fulfill those responsibilities and meet those goals along in there. It does include an evaluation process, so you know, are you meeting the goals and the tactical points along the way. And of course, we like to celebrate successes. So when you reach a goal, get out the ice cream and the bowl and the spoon, and let's do some celebrating. And so we do that. Recommendation 1. And again, we aren't going to tell you that you must do this or how you do this, but this is the significant recommendation that comes out of the study, is that you really need to look at an emergency, a crisis, some kind of transitional shelter where people can go on a temporary basis. This is not a shelter. We don't see where it would be a shelter where a family would move in for 6 months. This is enough time for a family, for individuals, to be able to move in and then be able to transition into other good ministries and agencies that are providing things in the county. And so that collaboration between those ministries and agencies will be vital in this. But families, singles with children, individuals, the street graduations, we love to see when you have people who are living on the street that they graduate off the street. If they're demoted to the street, again, put out of their home for whatever reason, let's get them off the street. We don't want people living in cars. We don't need children living in cars, in tents. That's just not going to be best for them in their growth as a child in school, but also for the family situation. So you want to be able to take care of that. So in this process, I just briefly show you here, if indeed the advisory council, Major Kelly, Jim, Brenda, as we went through the strategic planning process, if you decided to do this, all of these committees have to be involved in doing this, and these are standing committees for the Salvation Army. And first off would be property and facilities. Obviously, this building is not a shelter building. And in fact, this building is what the Salvation Army works out of to provide services, but its capacity is extremely limited. So it's not as though we could remodel this building to make something out of it. What we're going to need to do is find a building to remodel or find some land and build something that would accommodate, again, what the Advisory Council and the Salvation Army came up with to do. So the Program and Services Committee would need to decide what is it that you're going to do in this emergency crisis transitional shelter. How are you going to make that happen? What kind of programs and services are going to come alongside of that so that as a family comes in, what will you do with them for 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 days? What interaction will you have? What classes, what kinds of services will you provide them to help them as they transition into a more permanent setting? Once you know what those programs and services are going to be, then working with the property committee, you can determine this is the kind of building that we have or that we need. Salvation Army at their corporate headquarters in Atlanta has a property department, and they might even have some drawings that you could look at and assess and think, we could use something like this, and it might save some fees, architectural fees. But there are multiple Salvation Army shelters around the southern 15 states that some of those might apply here well. So now you've figured out what are the programs and services you're going to do in the shelter. You figure out where is it going to be, what's it going to look like. Is this a 1-story building? Is it a 2-story building? Are we buying something and remodeling? All of those kinds of things have to be decided and approved up through Greenville and Charlotte and then on to the corporate office in Atlanta. But then the Community Relations and Development Committee has to be telling the story to start to raise interest and let people know what the Salvation Army is intending to do. They raise that visibility, and we'll talk some more about that in a few minutes as well. And then, of course, the Finance Committee has to be working alongside the property and program so they understand what kind of impact is this going to have on budget, not only for capital needs, but for program needs. So those are the kinds of things that would go along in this whole strategic planning process with a revitalized advisory council alongside of all of this. So the emergency transitional shelter is the top need. Additional housing needs that would still be serviced by the emergency crisis shelter. Interestingly, not a huge need number-wise, but a huge need for the student who's going through it. And those are students who age out of foster care. Perhaps in January they turn 18. They're going to graduate in May or June. And when they become 18, they're out of the system. Where do they go? Where do they live? How can they manage themselves and still graduate? And so, again, it's not a large number, but it's something that should be considered if it can be included for a plan that would be going on. And then people being released from county jails. As you know, when someone goes into jail, whatever they're arrested for, as they go in, whatever they have is what they come out with. They aren't provided, when they come out of jail, they aren't provided a car and a house and a clothing and a job. They come out with nothing. Whatever they wore into jail that night, they come out with. Well, no wonder there's so much going back to the old ways when many times people who have been incarcerated in jail have burned a lot of family and friend bridges. They're in a bad place. They come out for whatever length of time that they're in. Maybe they've gone through a rehabilitation program, but still when they come out, maybe there's no family, there's no friends, but the only friends they have are those who they were associating with when they got into trouble. Typically, drug use and alcohol use. Typically. So what happens to them? Well, again, if there were 2, 3, 4 room capacity where people could come in before they were to transition into something else, you might just be able to save somebody from falling back into and ending up in jail in the next 10 days again for doing the same ill-advised, stupid things that they were doing before. that got them there. Bad decisions, typically. So those are some of the additional housing needs. Recommendation 2 goes to the homeless prevention part of it. And we would call this a countywide tactical advance. It's not where you have to launch a new program because you already have good stuff going on, but to bring that together even more deeply than what you have now, that you could collaborate even more together with agencies, ministries, and the county government, because this homelessness prevention, obviously, if we can keep people in their homes, if we can stop them from being put out of their homes, if we can address the issues that are causing them to be on that, sometimes it's illness, sometimes it's fire, sometimes it's flooding. Most of the time, it's bad decisions. Most of the time. So how do you address that? Well, again, you have good behavioral mental health services being provided. How do you expand that enough to work with the other agencies to work towards this homelessness prevention? This is a big issue for you that will really, this is the kind of place you can invest that you can save the county, you, a lot of money and time if we can expand the way to keep people in their present homes, if that's job training, if that's help with a month's rent, if that, all the things that go into that, the counseling that's needed to help them sort through the issues that they're trying to address where they're making bad decisions. All of that is part of it, becomes part of the homelessness prevention. And again, two big areas in this part of it, two big areas is transportation and the behavioral mental health. Now, I've talked about that a couple times. I'll beat that up some more if you want me to. But those of you who are working in social services, you know this is a huge issue for you, just to be able to get around and for people to be able to take advantage of the services. In our time here, we took a look at some potential properties, and of course we would recommend highly that if at all possible to have again an existing building that's remodeled or some land that could be developed and a building put on it that would be close to other agencies so that this transportation issue might even be abated because people can walk to an agency instead of missing out on the service that they desperately need at that point in time. There is some land over by the hospital, and of course you know that within the area fairly close around the hospital are multiple agencies dealing and working with these same kind of issues, and that might be a very ideal, the best location. We'd like to be able to think that. But again, that's something we don't come in and say this is where you have to build and buy. Rather, the Advisory Council really needs to dig in. The Property Committee of the Advisory Council needs to dig in, find a place that would fit the needs of the programs and services you're going to provide. As part of this homelessness prevention, I want to talk just briefly about a program that the Salvation Army has developed over the last 4 years nationally. And it's interesting that a ministry like the Salvation Army has been around 150 years, comes up with a new program and redevelops some things. But the Pathway of Hope is a new direction for the Salvation Army, and what they're wanting to do is to take it away from being case management. Excuse me. We want to take it away from being a case worker into case management, so that we certainly don't look down on providing food, a food basket, a night's shelter, access for utility and rent assistance. That's not a bad thing, but the Salvation Army and you know that it's a much longer process. And so in the Pathway of Hope, this allows the Salvation Army to come alongside and mentor people for up to 18 months, even 24 months in some instances, where they work with the family, the mom and kids, the dad and kids, or hopefully a mom and dad and kids, to address the issues that they have, to put a plan in place. They meet regularly to make sure they're staying in the plan, to work along with other agencies and ministries to help meet the needs of those people, but to keep them in a goal-driven plan that's going to address all the issues of a family. So it's spiritual, mental, physical, emotional, all of those parts of it are addressed in the Pathway of Hope program. And I would encourage advisory council members, I would encourage people in the community to learn more about this. This is an outcomes-based and driven part of the ministry. Again, through Pathway of Hope, we would help people temporarily, but what we really want to do is walk alongside them for a long time to help them work through the issues that have put them into where they are. So again, this ties directly into the homeless prevention program, that second recommendation. The first recommendation of the emergency crisis and transitional housing. One of the good things about this measured outcomes, this not only helps the Salvation Army and the case manager to see where are they in this process. As the Salvation Army introduced this program, social workers, those people with a master's in social, they were raising their hands and doing their happy dance because they could begin to put into use all that they had learned and been taught and all the achievement they had done, where they can walk alongside people for a longer period of time and really see these outcomes that need to happen. Another sidelight to this outcomes measurement program that the Pathway of Hope does is key with funders. Foundations, almost to a foundation, are now requiring outcome measurements before they're going to look and invest more money into an agency or a ministry. Individuals are more and more looking for outcomes measured. If I give you $50,000, how do I know how you're going to use the $50,000? I don't want to hear just a nice story about one family that was helped. Tell me what happened over a time period with that family and other families or individuals that you're working with. And so there's a significant, there's a software package that goes with it, the whole deal, that allows this measurement of outcomes to go through the Pathway of Hope. So that's one of the things that we would be suggesting. Again, I'll go through this part quickly, but Pathway of Hope, if you were to grow that program here, again, Jim and Brenda are at maximum capacity, so they would be hiring some staff to do that. In order to do that, the Program and Services Committee is going to have to figure out what is the Pathway of Hope, how do we do that, how do we institute it and launch it here. Property and facilities, it's probably not going to happen in this room, but there's going to be a need there to decide what to do, so the Property and Facilities Committee is going to help that. The Budget Committee is going to have to look at, okay, we now have 1 or 2 or 3 more staff. What happens to the budget? How do we grow the operational budget? If indeed it is some kind of different facility, how do we come up with the capital for that? And these are all the things that the Salvation Army says you got to be ready to provide monies for, so that if you're going to launch Pathway of Hope, it's sustainable. We don't want to launch it in 6 months, have to close it down because we can't sustain it. But not only staffing costs, utilities, insurance, property and health care, risk management, risk insurance, food storage and preparation, furnishings, all these kinds of things that go into a budget, as you well know. Recommendation 3 comes into the new programs and services required. If you're going to do these things, if you're going to launch new programs and services or expand current programs and services, you're going to have to get very serious about the raising of visibility, volunteers, and monies. Interestingly, in one of the interviews that I got to do, I had a very pointed conversation about the ability to raise money for a shelter. And I had someone tell me very directly, you can never raise money for a shelter. You'll never be able to fund it ongoing. Another 55 or 56 people, almost to a person, said the community would support this. So one strong voice, a lot of people in the community, again, churches, individuals, saying we can make this happen. One person saying you can't. It comes just as a caution to say, It's not a one-time deal where you raise money for a building and then everything's good. It's got to be long-term sustainability on operational monies. And I'm just going to go through this quickly, but you have to raise more visibility. As we talk to people, and it's in the report, you can see, it was interesting, this is one of the few studies we've done where people said, oh yeah, I know about that Salvation Army ministry, and you don't even offer it here. So they're reading about stuff in other places or remembering what they thought the Salvation Army did when they were growing up in another place, whatever. But the visibility here is low, but it's getting better. Again, Jim and Brenda are doing good work on that. But the wonderful thing about the Salvation Army is every day somebody's life is being changed at the Salvation Army. And that's a lot of it working in collaboration with ministries and agencies in town or in Greenville and the Salvation Army ministries that go on there. But the Advisory Council and the Community Relations and Development Committee are going to have to find ways to raise more visibility, to tell these stories of changed lives. That's what people want to hear about. That's what donors want to hear about. That's what volunteers want to hear about. Volunteers don't want to come in and bend, fold, and mutilate newsletters and put them in the mail. They want to know that what they're doing is impacting someone's life. That's the same thing with a donor. Whether it's a foundation, a corporate donor, or an individual, they want to know that their gift is actually impacting lives. So part of the strategic plan that would be put in place would be to develop this blueprint of what are you going to do. The print and broadcast media is mainly out of Greenville. You have some local newspapers, but what do you do with social media? What do you do with digital media and digital marketing to raise more visibility? The raising of volunteers. If you're going to have a shelter open, you're going to need some volunteers, and volunteers are going to have to be trained. They're going to be background checks to make sure that you have the right people in doing the volunteer work, because volunteers want to make that kind of impact, but they can assist with programs and services. Jim has a real desire to expand the disaster services in the county, and I've seen this happen many, many times with retired policemen, retired firemen who love to come alongside the Salvation Army and take care of that disaster canteen and take it out and feed people and help people at different events, whether it's a fire, you've had quite a few forest fires around, flooding. Dorian could have taken a different turn this past week and highly impacted this area of Carolinas, and that emergency disaster services, that can be done almost exclusively with volunteers. And then how are you as a county, not just the Salvation Army, this is not a Salvation Army problem, the problem impacts the Salvation Army, but how are you going to address this transportation issue? And that may be some kind of super committee that you put together across the county, however that's going to work out. It's also part of recommendation 3 in this raising of visibility, volunteers and monies. You seriously, once those committees are up and running, you're going to know what's it going to cost for the property you're going to do, what's the impact on a budget, and the budget that Jim and Brenda have now in the county is probably going to have to be more than doubled on an operational basis if you're going to have an emergency crisis shelter going on. And that comes from years and years of experience of the Salvation Army running shelters. You have to have staff at a shelter, you have to have security at a shelter, not only equipment-wise, but people-wise. Somebody has to be living on the shelter to make sure that it's secure. So there's a lot of issues there in sustainability and being able to make that happen, as well as growing a much larger operational budget. And in that, I've broken this out so that you can see, again, and you know if you've been through a capital campaign with your agency or your ministry, you know how important a role the board plays and the committees are on that. But it would really have to be seen as a county-wide capital campaign and a county-wide sustainability campaign. It might be a capital campaign and endowment, where you could raise monies the endowment monies would go towards the operational budget. But this is a step that Jim and Brenda cannot decide on their own. Major Andy Kelly won't let them do that. But even with Major Andy Kelly, and you're fortunate, just to say, Major Andy Kelly, I've known him for years and years. He came in this summer into Greenville. He was in Austin, Texas, where he just completed a very successful large capital campaign. So he knows what it takes to make all that happen and to put this kind of campaign together. But this is going to have to be a time that the county decides we're in on this. If the county doesn't decide, and what I mean by county is not only agencies and churches and ministries, but individuals, you. If you don't decide to get in on it, then there's really not a hope of having a crisis or emergency shelter. The Salvation Army, as it is right now in Pickens County, can't do that, are not able to do it, couldn't fund it, couldn't make it work. But if indeed it is seen as something you need, and from what we saw with the collaboration and the interest and just the solid sense of ministry and solid sense of knowing how to help people that's already in the community, you have such a great opportunity to make this highly effective and have a significant impact on the lives of people. It's all in place. It's a wonderful thing. You don't have to have a bunch of new things put into place to make it happen. Revitalize the board and do a strategic plan and begin to engage people to get the right people on board. If you've read Good to Great, the book by Jim Collins, you'll know that in that book he talks about having the right people on the board and then having the right people in the right seats on the bus. So he gets people on the bus as part of the board because you're going to take this journey, and as being the right people on the bus, sometimes you don't have the right people on the bus, so you need to bless and release, and you let those people go, but that allows space to bring more people on the bus, but you want the right people in the right seats on the bus to make all of this happen. So it really is going to take a county-wide effort to make all of this work, to impact the lives of people that you want to be able to impact. Now, I have another slide that deals a little more internally about where the Salvation Army is fundraising. I can certainly talk about that, or I can answer any questions that you would have regarding the report, the recommendations, the appendices, any of those kinds of things. I'd be glad to do that. Yes?
I have a question, Paul, about whether it was. Thank you.
Yeah.
I had a. Hello. Okay. I had a question about during the interviews that you had. Was there any indication as to if there's a breakdown of the number of homeless men that need to be served versus homeless women and children? Was there any indication as to, does the shelter mainly need to focus on one area, or would that shelter need to house both men and women?
Our response would be yes. There was indication, and again, I go back to this point in time count that shows people who are homeless on the streets that can be seen in this point in time count versus the school district's definition of homeless. That's more than 10% of the school district population, student population. So we would say to you that the Programs and Services Committee of the Council would need to dig into that research to find out what is the most appropriate segment of the community that needs to be served. Is it moms with kids in a crisis emergency? Is it dads with kids? Is it families? And I think from other facilities that I've seen for the Salvation Army, it could serve multiple kinds of things if the facility is designed correctly with the right security in it. Obviously, when you put men and women in a facility, stuff naturally happens that we don't want to have happen. That's part of the security issue that you have. But the facility can be designed that way. Whether it's a new build or a remodel, it can be designed that you could serve different kinds of population in there, even back to the kids coming out of foster care, someone coming out of county jail, that kind of thing. You could have it so it would work that way. But again, you have to look at the kinds of plans that are already in place or the facilities that are possible, and then can you afford that? From our perspective, there's no reason to come in and say, you need a 36-bed facility that will serve these people, when you looked at the cost of capital for a 36-bed facility and operations, it might blow the thing so out of water you'd be discouraged and say, well, we can't ever do anything. But our sense was, other than one person, everybody that took part in this wants to do something to help these folks. That was an urgent sense of the people that we interviewed, and I think that can happen. So that again becomes part of the added research that needs to be done by the Program and Services Committee of the Council. Any other questions, comments? Yes?
I need to read and delve into what you have.
Yes.
So are you available afterwards for questions? Because that's where I'll have the questions. And then my other question is, and maybe I'm getting too deep in the weeds because I have not read anything. You're saying that you want to build a facility where it's close to all these agencies, behavioral health and et cetera. But what about the aspect of bringing behavioral health and that to the facility? They're comfortable in that facility, and maybe that be something, and maybe that's something the advisory board or council needs to discuss. But
absolutely. And when I talked about homelessness prevention, that might become a sense of a one-stop center, an area that everybody could come to and not have to travel around to so many parts to get the services they need. We've seen that be very successful in lots of communities. And again, you already have this sense of collaboration, working together. That could be one of the steps that could work very well for you. But that, again, that's something that you all need to decide that's what you're going to do and make it happen. But that's exactly right.
have you seen that?
Yes. Yes.
I just think that would cut down on the transportation and a lot of that. And then the people that are staying at this, trying to rebuild, they're comfortable there and bringing those agencies already there to help them.
Right. Right. And, on the transportation side of it, maybe there's a way that you've got a lot of car dealerships around in the county. Maybe there's 2 car dealerships that each year will donate a van, and that the county would pick up the insurance on the van, and you could use volunteers, well-vetted volunteers who would do dial-a-ride kinds of things to help people in certain situations get to where they need to be to help that situation. Implementing a bus system across the county, that's probably not my lifetime, but
I don't see that this is a rural community, and
yeah.
I just don't see that being a viable asset. But the van.
I mean, you folks are real smart. Let's dig into it and find out how can that work. If anybody else wants, I have cards here. Part of our work with Jim, we're happy to answer any questions. If there was a group that wanted to meet again and discuss things, we'll come back up and talk about those kinds of things as well. This is not a come in, do a report, and dump it and leave. We'd like to be involved long term, but again, if you want to talk to us, we're happy to do that. We can do conference calls, we can come back up and meet further about any questions that you have. Email on here. If you want to email me some questions or some comments, we're very open to that and would be grateful for it.
Question for you, Paul.
Yes.
Just kind of for the benefit of the group. There's a lot of factors in play here, obviously, a lot of things that need to be strengthened and addressed. But walk us through logistically, hypothetically, timing, the logistics of that. What does the strategic plan look like, length of time? What would a feasibility study do, capital campaign, just so we kind of have a guesstimate. Obviously, this isn't going to happen overnight.
Right. Yeah, it's not by Monday we're going to have Jim expected to have a board in place and start on a building. And with the Salvation Army, as you would know, the Salvation Army owns all the Salvation Army property. And in the 15 southern states, the corporate office in Atlanta, Georgia, is that corporate office that owns all the properties. So that if you looked at the lease agreement, it's with the Georgia Corporation. It's not with Greenville or it's not with Pickens. So because of that corporate background there, it does extend timing on things, but there's also safeguards in place where the Salvation Army has learned a lot of things not to do and saves a lot of grief in that process. So what I would suggest could happen, Jim needs to add some folks to his advisory council. I would say get after that, start recruiting people. We have materials that we can do with Jim. Jim's capable of doing this, but get people on the board. Let them experience Christmas with the Salvation Army. October, November, December get pretty wild and crazy for the Salvation Army. It's a wonderful time because there's a lot of help. A lot of people being helped. So it'd be great for new board members to be part of that, to see that, to understand what goes on instead of coming on in February and everybody saying, well, wait till next Christmas. What's going to happen? Well, if you've already experienced it, you have an appreciation for what goes on. I would say if you could get your board up to 15 to 18, council up to 15 or 18 by November, December, I'd be glad to come back up and do a new board member orientation, because so you understand more about the Salvation Army. But that would allow you in late January, give Jim and Brenda time to recuperate after Christmas, late January, early February, you could launch into a strategic planning process. And a strategic planning process you can do with your council, advisory council, you can do over a couple weekends, Friday night and Saturday, but then there's a lot of work that's done by the committees. But the timeline for a strategic plan goes on until the plan is completed. So it's not as though you get together for a couple hours on an afternoon, write out a plan, and boom, it's in place and it's going to work. There's a lot of, again, going back to what are the goals, what are the tactical steps to get there, who's going to be responsible for that. You can't just say to the program committee, tell us about the Pathway of Hope. Somebody on the Program and the Services Committee actually has to experience and learn and read about Pathway of Hope so they can bring it back and talk about it. So somebody would be assigned to that. So it's that kind of strategic planning process. After that, part of that plan, you'd come up, the council would come up with the idea of, okay, we found this property and we're going to remodel it, or we found this property and we're going to build on it. To do those things, then, you're going to have some numbers, some finance numbers, not only of what is it going to cost to remodel, but what's it going to cost to run it. So then you take those numbers into the third step that Jim described, which is a feasibility study, which is when a company like ours would come back and interview multiple people, donors, individuals, corporations, foundations, churches, all kinds of folks to say, the Salvation Army needs to do this. As a community, this is what they said that we need to do. We're going to do this, and in order to do this, I'm making up a number, we need to raise $2 million. So we take that $2 million out into the community and say, is it feasible to raise $2 million? Sometimes it comes back and there's such community engagement with it, they say, actually, you could raise $2.5 million. Sometimes the groundwork hasn't been laid enough and people don't understand what their need is for this crisis emergency shelter, and you can only raise $1.4 million. So then you have to decide, do we scale back on this to get to the 1.4, or do we spend some more time raising some more visibility and relationships to get to the $2 million? Feasibility study is probably 3 to 4 months from the launch to the completion of it. For us and from any other consulting firms that you would use, bring in a team of people and you interview as many people as you can. It's face interviews are the best interviews. Phone interviews are good, but FaceTime is absolutely the best. And in that process, it's some very in-depth questioning about, okay, if we're going to raise $2 million, who do we talk to? Who can help us raise $2 million? All those kinds of things. So then, from that process, you would go into a capital campaign. And again, the Salvation Army requires that you bring in a consulting firm to help you raise $2 million. And that anymore, capital campaigns are taking they used to be 9 to 12 months a bunch of years ago. Now they're anywhere from 18 to 36 months, dependent upon how things go in the process and how engaged people are, how engaged the council is. I can take you from a part here, such as Austin, Texas, where the major was, where over 36 months they raised multiple millions of dollars for multiple new facilities. And there are sources that we can help you with to get to those kinds of dollars. I can take you to another community where the advisory board members formed a partnership council, and 8 people raised $8 million in about 6 weeks. Anything in between all of that can happen. So a time frame from when you would have a strategic plan by February or March to when you might do a feasibility study next May or June to when you would actually put a shovel in the ground or start ripping and tearing and doing the remodel, you're probably looking at late next year or 2021, early 2021. And again, there are a lot of safeguards that the Salvation Army puts in place on this to make sure that long term there aren't issues then that you have to deal with financially that become too much of a burden. Yes?
How optimistic are you about this developing here? For instance, I think it's easier to get to this building from any place in Pickens County than it is to get to the Salvation Army Center from semi-rural East Greenville County. I'm optimistic about our being able to do this.
Mm-hmm.
What about you?
Yeah, and again, from all the people that we talked to, and the research that we've done, we had all these voices that said, we need to do something, we want to do something, we will help make this happen, to this one solo voice saying, you can't do it. So I think this overwhelming majority of people, if they're focused in the right way and get after it, I think they can make it work. I'm optimistic from the resources that are in the county to make it happen.
And from your experience in other areas that you've seen this happen?
Yes. Yep. No slam dunk. It's going to be a lot of hard work. A lot of hard work, but it can happen. Absolutely. Yes.
Would you not want to do the feasibility study first so you know what size facility that the county needs for service?
No, you want to do the strategic plan so that you can begin to understand what are the programs and services you're going to put in that facility, and that helps shape the facility. Again, I might say, oh, you need a 36-bed facility. Well, after you've studied the programs and services, come up with what they say is going to happen in the building, what you maybe need are 15 beds, but you need a computer lab, you need some rooms to do some individual counseling, you need a larger room for some group counseling and group trainings. I mean, all those kinds of things need to be thought of to get to a point where you have a good number to take out to the community and say, we need to raise this much money, and here's what it's going to look like. You have drawings that say, this is what the building's going to look like, here's what's going to go on inside. We already know in order to do these program services inside, we're going to have to add these kinds of staff people. Now you have a capital budget and an operational budget. And in fact, the Salvation Army for a bunch of years did not do a strategic plan and had multiple capital campaigns that did not meet their goal because they didn't have that foundational work that drove the council and the board to accomplish what they needed and have the information they needed to take out to potential funders. Yes?
I was just going to ask, you have to excuse my ignorance, but I want to piggyback on some of the other things that have been mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Would the Salvation Army be willing to partner with other companies like the Voc Rehab, medical facilities that do get federal money that comes in that could bring like a one-stop shop?
Absolutely.
To an area?
Absolutely. We have multiple examples of that happening. In the hundreds of that happening across the whole country. I'm more familiar with the 15 southern states, and we have multiple instances of that kind of collaboration into something.
Okay.
Yep.
And also, it'd be good, currently, there is a transportation thing that's moving forward. It's called 10 at the Top. They represent the top 10 counties in the upstate. and it's called Connecting the Future. And it would be good to have the Salvation Army a part of those talks. We've got a lot of big, powerful people in those meetings, but we need people that know the people.
And what the needs are. I'm sure Jim would love to be. I'm going to speak for Jim here and volunteer Jim to be on yet another. Have you?
Okay.
Great. That's the kind of visibility and involvement that needs to be happening. Where I'm glad to hear that, Jim. Any other questions? I'm past my hour deadline. I thank you for coming out. You've shown your interest by coming out this morning. If we can answer any questions, we can do them through Jim. You can contact me directly. And may this all happen because of the Lord's involvement in it.
Thank you, Paul. Hold on just a second before we go. I did want it, Vicki and Dr. Bachnight, would you guys stand just for a minute? These are our advisory council members here in attendance, and I should have acknowledged you earlier. If you've got questions, please speak with them, as they're already part of our family. I just want to put out my role as director and coming out here is a personal commitment based on my relationship with the Lord and trying to serve the community of Pickens County. And that's what I want to do. I cannot do this on my own, but I will walk with and lead and beside, if you'll join me, we will do this side by side. We will take the hill. I think the Salvation Army is uniquely positioned as a good source that everybody can collaborate with. I am not a minister. I am not a church. I am a layman. I am not an officer. I won't be changed in 3 years and shipped somewhere else. I've tried to, in the last 2 years, to develop the relationship and earn the trust of this community. And I'm doing that from a personal commitment. And I want to provide a safe place that we can all come together. It'll only be as we feel safe and working together that we can do this. And I just think we're well positioned for that. And as we do that, we become a portal that provides access for everyone to come and serve our neighbors together. That's the vision I have. But I need you. I need participation, or I need recommendations of folks to join us. I see opportunity in it, that we'll look back one day and be able to say, look what we all did together. And look at the what's the word, where you leave a lasting impression over years. A legacy. Thank you. Man, I'm getting old. It's an opportunity for a legacy. And I'm 55, and this is my last hurrah in my mind. This is going to be my closing hill. But I'd like to take this hill together. I thank you all for being here. This is Brenda Duncan. She's going to kill me. Brenda is my right hand and has been serving this community for years. And I can't thank her enough for... We've worked together, and I'm proud of what we've been able to do thus far. And she is the foundation of what we're doing in Pickens County. Brenda Duncan is. So I want you to know that. For those that are interested, they're in the timing of our assessment and the assessment's results. As of August 2019, there's a housing report that's been out, the South Carolina Housing Report, and it's done by the Department of South Carolina State Housing Finance and Development Authority. If you are not familiar with this report, I've got 3 copies of it on the back table for those that are interested in getting deeper. Paul mentioned the PIT count, the point-in-time count, which is a statewide homelessness report. That came out last month. It's quite a lengthy document. Very good information in both these reports. I have a few copies of that available on this back desk as you leave as well. And if I haven't forgotten anything else, thank you for your time. Reach out to us. You've got my contact information, and I'll be speaking with you soon. God bless you, and thank you for your time. Yep, you're welcome.